Embattled yet defiant, Venezuela's president says he's not quitting as the opposition vows to pursue all means to oust him from power. But will the opposition's plan work? And how is an economic crisis contributing to the political instability? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Laura Kyle. Just a decade ago, Venezuela's socialist project was held up as a model in Latin America of an alternative to market-based economics. Now, 3 years after the death of Hugo Chavez, the movement he began is merely limping on. And Venezuela is in trouble. Public debt is spiralling out of control. Inflation is set to reach 700%, and the IMF said the economy shrank 10% last year. The crisis has inflamed Venezuela's opposition, which is now pursuing a multi-pronged strategy that began with protests to force President Nicolas Maduro to step down. Despite winning a landslide victory in December's parliamentary elections, opposition lawmakers feel they've been crippled by a Supreme Court that they say supports the government. Maduro led a rival rally over the weekend against US sanctions and what the government describes as imperialist interference in Venezuela's affairs.
We have the world's support, the world's backing. We're right. What we're demanding, what we're fighting for, is fair. We're not asking for anything, no favors. We're asking for what's rightfully ours. That Venezuela not be threatened by a foreign government, that Venezuela not be threatened by the Yankee empire.
Well, Venezuela's opposition is hoping the power of the street can force President Maduro to heed the calls for change.
Maduro, ahórranos la tragedia.
Maduro, save us from tragedy and resign. You cannot continue. Do Venezuela that favor. Not only the country, not only for the Venezuelan opposition, but your own party and the Chavismo foundations will thank you forever.
Well, opposition leaders say it would be political suicide for them to pursue just one strategy for ousting Maduro, so they've settled on three. Lawmakers are proposing a constitutional amendment to shorten presidential terms from 6 years to 4. That would mean Maduro's term would end this year. But even if the amendment passes, it could get overturned by the Supreme Court. Judges there tend to favour the president. So the opposition is also pushing for a recall referendum. They need 4 million signatures just to get the voting process started. And to win, they would need more than 7.5 million votes against Maduro. The third approach is a grassroots campaign, street protests to pressure Maduro to resign. So far, he's dismissed all calls for resignation, accusing critics of trying to topple the government, just as they did under Chavez. Well, let's turn now to our guests to further discuss these proposals and their chances of success. Joining us from Caracas is Phil Gunson, senior analyst at the International Crisis Group. In Washington, D.C., Sonia Schott, independent Venezuelan journalist and political analyst. And also in Caracas via Skype, Daniel Furman, researcher at the Center of Political Studies at Andreas Bello Catholic University. Welcome, all of you. Thanks very much for joining us here on Inside Story. Daniel, before we get into the nitty-gritty of the opposition's attempts to oust Maduro, can we first of all establish why it is that so many Venezuelans no longer support him?
Well, thank you. First of all, I think we have to start from the beginning. Venezuela is going through the worst economic crisis in history. There are severe food shortages, long queues to get basic products, basic services. Violence is up, crime is up. Venezuelans are having a really tough time making ends meet. So in turn, Maduro's popularity has gone down because the government has not owned up to its responsibility in the crisis. The government has been methodical in finding ways to see the fault in others, be it what they call the empire, referring to the United States, or be it what they call an economic war against the revolution, or even blaming the opposition. That line of debate, that line of reasoning has not resonated with the Venezuelan people. The Venezuelan people blame Maduro's government directly for the crises, and the government has not been able to respond to that. So that's why Maduro's popularity and the whole government's popularity has gone down very, very sharply in the last few months and years.
Sonia, is it fair for Venezuelans to blame Maduro's government for this crisis?
Yes, actually, well, the big picture is the fall of the oil prices and the lack of experience of the Maduro's government to deal with that and to meet the needs of the Venezuelan population. So there is a huge crisis, as it was described. But the problem is that the government seems to be a little bit erratic in the way to put in the table some solutions. Right now, seems that the government is trying to make some choices, whether to pay the debt or whether to pay for imports in order to provide goods and medicines which are needed in Venezuela. So the government decided to pay the debt. So, and this is why we are seeing all this economic crisis right now in Venezuela with the shortage of medicines, goods, and all that.
Why, Sonia, why do you think it made that decision to pay the debt before paying its own coffers and therefore supplying its own people with the basic necessities?
Well, this is actually very important for the government in order to maintain credibility internationally. Especially because right now, as I said, the oil prices are going down, and there is no way to see that this situation is going to change. And they would like to maintain some credibility abroad in order probably to access credits, which is really very difficult since investors, international investors, they don't believe in the Venezuelan government and their ability to manage the crisis. Well, with the exception of China and Russia.
So, Phil, it sounds slightly as if Maduro and his government has been rather backed into a corner then, being forced to pay the debt rather than being able to look within and improve the situation within. So is it entirely to blame for the situation?
Well, the seeds of this clearly were sown many years ago with the choices that Maduro's predecessor, Hugo Chavez, took in terms of economic and social policy, which have essentially involved a kind of populist deal. The oil revenue was distributed among the poor, no thought for tomorrow. So, for example, no funds like Saudi Arabia has, for example, to deal with times when, just as now, the oil price is low, the coffers are bare, and the money's all been spent. The money was spent in many different ways. It was spent on corruption, it was spent on projects that never came to anything, it was spent distributing large amounts of goods and resources to the poor, often in a very inefficient and very expensive way. And now the cupboard is bare. As I say, there's really nothing much to do except reform economic policy, which the government seems set against doing.
Why is that? Why is it so against reforming economic policy?
Well, I think there are a couple of important reasons. One is that ideologically, of course, they feel that going to an organization like the IMF, which is the obvious place that a country in this kind of difficulty would turn to, that would be a betrayal of the revolution. Right. It would be a complete negation of everything that they've said since the government, more or less, since the government came to power. And so to do so would almost be to declare an end to the revolution and to alienate those remaining supporters who still believe in the project that Hugo Chavez founded. That's one reason. And another reason may be that a lot of the people at the top of the tree in this regime have been making very large amounts of money, for example, out of an extremely dysfunctional exchange system, which in which the government maintains a rate of 10 bolivars to the dollar for most international transactions, and yet the parallel market rate is at over 1,000, something like 1,200 to the dollar now. So you can imagine, if you can get dollars at 10 bolivars to the dollar, you can make a very, very large fortune overnight.
Daniel, the opposition clearly feels it can do better. It has got a lot of support, as shown by the December legislative elections. It's got this multi-pronged approach to trying to topple Maduro. Let's look at first its grassroots campaign. It launched this on Saturday with protests. How did they go? Are you getting a sense that there'll be much momentum for that?
Well, I think Venezuelans are not happy with the situation, and Venezuelans do want change. The main aspiration of the Venezuelan citizens is for political and economic change. Just to provide some context on the previous point, the Venezuelan economy is absolutely, completely controlled by the government. There is no free market, or there is very little of what could count as free market. So that's why the government is to be held responsible, because they control all aspects of the economy. As Phil just said, not only the exchange rates and the exchange control, but they do control even prices of basic products and means. So yes, that I just wanted to provide that bit of context. And to add on Sonia's point, yes, we are going through an oil prices crisis, but the economic model sustained by Chavismo was only viable with oil prices at over $100. With oil prices nearing $20, it gets very difficult in a country that only produces oil and that heavily relies on imports. So yes, to get to this point, the opposition has set out a route of 3 ways to oust President Maduro and to achieve political change. They are, first of all, the constitutional amendment, which would see the presidential term be reduced to 4 years, from 6 years to 4 years, and eliminating what Hugo Chavez made into a constitutional amendment in its own right, which was indefinite re-election. So that's on the table. The other proposal is to call on the president's resignation. And we saw street protests demanding the president's resignation on last Saturday. And then the third point is a referendum to recall Nicolas Maduro's term. So it seems to be sort of, let's try to go in every direction the Constitution allows us to go in order to achieve this change. The truth of the matter is, though, at least 2 of those options are extremely hard. All 3 of those options are going to be an uphill battle because the executive branch does control all institutions and all other branches of government except the National Assembly, which was won by the opposition in a landslide in December. So to place the decision of change in Nicolas Maduro's hand, to rely on Maduro's will or conscience to resign over his handling of the crises is not a very realistic approach.
Okay, Sonia, which is the realistic approach? Because we, as Daniel was saying, we do have these institutions in place that support Maduro. I'm thinking of the Supreme Court and the National Electoral Council. So is it at all realistic that any of these approaches are going to work?
Well, actually, there is a window of opportunity in the recall referendum before Maduro reached the 4th year of his period. The point is unclear. Everything in Venezuela is really unclear. And we have to take into account that this is not going to be only with the support of the opposition, because we have noticed that the Chavismo is also divided. And the dissatisfaction is also among Chavistas. But probably the best way to think about the future in Venezuela is that Chavismo is going to be a force, and that the transition is going to be a smoothly transition.
Can you expand on that? How do you mean that Chavismo will be a force?
It's still a force because it is been rooted in Venezuelan political spectrum since Chavez arrived into power. So it is very difficult to make disappear all these people from in a political move, in a very fast political mode. This is not going to happen. And I think whatever happens in Venezuela needs to promote ways of dialogue between Chavismo and the opposition. It's the only way to move forward.
Do you see that taking place?
With a reasonable agenda. I'm sorry?
Do you see that taking place? Do you see the opposition offering that to Maduro?
Actually, no. And there is another factor to take into account, which will bring a little bit struggle, or will be an upside-down factor in the Venezuelan reality, which will be social unrest. If this is going to happen, everything will change without any control. But right now, I don't see that, because the power of negotiation of the opposition in the National Assembly is not there, because they lost the supermajority.
Phil, do you agree with that? Do you agree with Sonia that the referendum, weaker referendum, changing the constitution, street protests, none of that is really going to work because of this idea of Chavismo, which is very strong and needs to continue through Venezuela? Do you agree that none of these approaches are going to take place?
Yeah, I agree basically with what Sonia was saying. None of those, under the present circumstances, as of today, 14th of March or whatever it is, it's impossible to imagine that the government will relax its control over the institutions sufficiently for any of those routes to work. However, as Sonia also said, the situation is fluid. There could be a change in terms of popular unrest. There could be a change in terms of the vision of the military, which we haven't mentioned, but which is a factor which has to be taken into account, and which to some extent is acting with a degree of autonomy which we never saw under the Chavez government. As far as whether dialogue is possible, I think the government is dead set against it, because dialogue to them means the end of the regime, and for many of them, the end of the regime potentially means ending up behind bars. That's something that clearly individuals at the top are extremely nervous about. The opposition, I think, has offered in various ways talks with the government, and I think that offer may still be on the table to some extent, but conditions have to change in order for it to take place. I very much agree that that's the way to go. The way to avoid a violent breakdown, a violent change of regime, severe disruption, possible violence on the streets, and more deaths is definitely to talk. But right now, that doesn't seem to be a feasible proposition.
OK, let's take this opportunity to broaden out the discussion. Because although Chavismo may remain in Venezuela, we do see across Latin America leftist and socialist parties on the retreat. 2 weeks ago, Bolivian voters rejected Evo Morales' referendum to allow him to stay on for another term as president. Now he's at the centre of a scandal that involves a secret relationship, a child, and an alleged embezzlement and political misconduct. On Sunday, more than 1 million Brazilians joined anti-government protests across the country. Their embattled President Dilma Rousseff is dealing with the biggest corruption scandal in Brazil's history and is facing calls for her impeachment. Others have also been voted out of office. Mauricio Macri's historic win in Argentina's recent elections ended 12 years of leftist rule. Daniel, if we look at all these events, can we link them up and call it a trend of, if not a disappearing leftism, then a declining trend of socialist values?
Well, first of all, I think what we saw in the last 10 to 15 years in Latin America was not only the rise of leftist movements, some of them indigenous, such as Mr. Morales' government, some of them coming from the military, such as Chavez's government, but we also saw a sort of alliance, a cartel, if you will, of Latin American governments that had the objective of and the purpose of allowing each other to sustain and to increase their political powers. There is a very clear coincidence in all of these regimes and in all of these styles of government, beyond the whole ideological left and right issue, of concentrating political power. And that sometimes has meant going against the media, strengthening its stronghold on free speech. So what we're seeing now is consequence not only of each country's crises, because every country has its own realities. But also, I mean, we can see it in Brazil, it's corruption. In Venezuela and Argentina, it can be the economic crisis. In Bolivia, as you just said, it's a scandal. But overall, I think there is a sense of needing change in America over models that have grown tiresome for the citizens of these countries.
So can you say then, Sonia, that these, broadly speaking, these leftist rule parties can only be sustained if the economy is strong and healthy?
Yeah, actually everything is about the economy at the very end. And right now the situation, the economic forecast for Latin America is not that rosy, especially in the coming years, according to the financial institutions or the international institutions. But the main point right now is that Venezuela has lost two major allies, Brazil and Argentina. And actually it's becoming more isolated in the international context. Well, okay, with the exception of China and Russia, but otherwise in the regional context, Venezuela has lost influence, which is one of the consequences of the lack of money in order to finance political projects around the region, right? So it is a consequences that we are going to see. Venezuela doesn't have that much support that it has in the past.
If the opposition did get in, if Maduro did resign and the vice president didn't take over, the opposition got in, would it A, regain some of that international support, and B, how, more importantly, how would they approach the economy differently? Phil?
Well, there would have to be a period of transition, I think. I mean, I think the current circumstances in Venezuela, economically and socially speaking, are so dire that simply to come into power and to imagine that you're going to be able to sweep away controls, price controls and exchange controls overnight and restore a market economy would be unrealistic. What I think is probably the case is that if it were to happen, the advent of a government, a Venezuelan government run by the MUD, the opposition coalition, would immediately restore a good deal of confidence in the international financial community. There would likely be much more money flowing into Venezuela, and that would certainly ease the situation. But it's going to be very, very difficult to put this right. There's been an enormous destruction of infrastructure in all sorts of ways. Just to look at the oil industry, for example, the collapse in oil production, the pilfering of huge amounts of money. I mean, we're talking about billions of dollars from the state oil corporation, but also in electricity, in water, all kinds of utilities, infrastructure across the board. There's an enormous amount of reconstruction to be done. The good news, of course, is that that means jobs for people. And there is, in the medium term, I think, a good deal of potential optimism. But of course, we have to get through this very, very difficult period.
Daniel, we've got 1 minute left, so just briefly, do you see this period of transition, of political transition happening in Venezuela?
Yes, I think change is inevitable. It's a matter of when and not if. I think this stage of Chavismo is coming to an end. I don't think Chavismo is going to be swept away by any means, but I do think that this stage of Chavismo is nearing its end because of how they have handled the crisis. So I think the transition is a necessity for Venezuela, and I do see it basically around the corner. It's going to be a matter of who the actors are that sit at the negotiation table, and to see how they handle and how the cost of leaving power may make some people in higher government posts very, very against the transition. But I do think that there are people looking for a transition even among the government ranks. OK, very interesting indeed. Big change ahead for Venezuela. Thanks very much to all our guests for joining us here today. Phil Gunson, Sonia Schott and Daniel Furman. And thank you too very much for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, that's aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page, that's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story.
And you can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Laura Kyle, and the whole team here. Bye for now.